Hey guys, so of course YCS Dortmund just concluded over the past weekend, and as usual I wanted to highlight some of the most played hand traps as well as staples in the topping deck list that were available to help you prepare for your next events. And so definitely a huge shout out to YGOProdeck.com, a really good resource to find all these topping deck lists. And of course a big shout out to my sponsors as always. Definitely makes my day if you guys use those discount codes for Yu-Gi-Oh singles or supplies, so definitely go check them out. Now in terms of the topping deck lists that were available for this video, I could find 37, which keep in mind that, it was top 64 at Dortmund, so basically we had a little over half, and this is basically what the pie chart looked like among the deck lists that were available. So kind of for the most part I think reflects what the top 64 was like, but at the same time again, when you look at some of the most played hand traps and staples, keep in mind of some of the deck lists that were actually available for this video, which might influence that. Alright, so let's just provide an overview of the hand traps. And so we actually had a median of 6 hand traps in the main, ranging from 0 to 15. This is actually a lot lower than the 9 that we saw after YCS Brazil and Vancouver that I had done. So certainly a downward trend in that. But in terms of the side deck, about 6 hand traps in the side as a median number. This was slightly higher than the 5 that we saw at YCS Vancouver as well as Brazil. Now in terms of board breakers, it actually kind of essentially was the same between main and side, ranging from 0 to 14 with a median of 5, so definitely a little bit lower than what we saw at YCS Vancouver as well. Now in terms of the most played hand traps in the topping deck list that were publicly available, we are starting with Ash Blossom. Once again, as usual, still a lot of people main decking it rather than siding it. Of course, you are potentially playing into something like Talents and Thrusts, but at the same time, it's a very good generic hand trap right now, especially with the rise of Tearlaments, and Ash can be actually pretty good against them, especially trying to stop something like, let's say, the Agito or the Kelbeck, just like those millers, just so you prevent them from snowballing, and also even on like your turn, let's say, and your opponent just happens to have that Havness, you can also stop that. But of course against Unchained it can actually be quite impactful as well, and you actually saw a rise in like a lot of the branded lists yet again, and of course Ash goes really hard against those strategies. So next we have Droll, which is actually kind of interesting, right? Because it was actually seeing a decline in play the last month or so, with, for example, Mannadium not being as popular as people maybe thought they would be going into the Dune format. But now it's actually come back. And I don't think, while it is interesting, I don't think it's actually surprising, because you do constantly see this with Droll with, when people don't really respect, decks like Mannadium, for example, and like just take the Droll out of the side deck, then those decks can kind of start thriving again. So you kind of have to keep them in check every now and then. So still something that you might want to watch out for in your next event. We also have Bestial Druid's-Worm, of course, with Magma being put to 1, you're going to see a lot of Druid's-Worm instead. And of course, it was actually, even with Magma at 3, Druid's-Worm was actually better in terms of the Unchained matchup. But now with the rise in Tearlaments, you're going to see more Bestials again, which is something that I mentioned in my last video, where I'm not really a huge fan when Tearlaments are meta, just because then it becomes where like a lot of decks start converging towards, they either play Shifter or they just play a lot more Bestials, which makes it really hard for a lot of the other rogue decks out there. Next we have Imperm, which has certainly fallen, and it's funny because I was actually, not too long ago when I was doing like a hand trap staple tier list video, I was talking about how, I was watching Jesse Cotton's staple tier list video, and how, he wasn't like a huge fan of Imperm, and I think that also still makes sense. It's not like the biggest impact card right now, but I think because it's just such a generic staple, and I think a lot of us, admittedly by habit, kind of tend to put Imperm in anyways, but you know what, it's still nonetheless still a pretty good card. We also have the other Bestial and Magmanaut. It is at 1, but you know what? It's still solid. It can, especially when you have Dragon Link as a tier 1 deck still, and they're going to main deck this anyway. So, you know what? Still comes hard, especially with the rise of Tearlaments. Next we have Nibiru. So now this has actually fallen in favor of, let's say, something like Droll and Lockbird. So Nibiru was still pretty popular last time I did this. Like you have like Unchained, where Nibiru can be pretty effective. Of course, they can sometimes go into Nightmare Griffin after getting Nibiru, which is really FTK against a lot of different strategies out there. So I think, this is another one like Droll. If you don't respect it, it's going to eventually come back. So you got to just kind of keep those things in balance. So next we have DD Crow. Now this is a card that actually saw a huge decline in play ever since the Bestials came out a year ago, because the Bestials for the most part served as like a better replacement for DD Crow, especially in that time where we had Tearlaments being so rampant. But now with DD Crow it can also be useful, because Purrely, for example, they can try to exceed summon by using like whatever Purrely spell, quick play spell in the grave, and you can at least get rid of that and try to stop that. And again, with the rise of Tearlaments, DD Crow is quite good on top of the Bestials, especially with Magma being put to 1. And then finally, you also have something like Floowandereeze that can actually play typically 1 copy of this in the main deck, because they can search it. So now speaking of Thunder, we unfortunately have Shifter still up here. So and the interesting thing is I'm actually noticing some of the Sprite as well as some of the branded lists playing Shifter again in the side, which is something we kind of briefly saw a year ago as well because of Tearlaments. And so it's weird because, you know, of course, these branded Sprite, those kind of decks, they don't play optimally under Shifter. It's just more so that they can at least kind of get by under Shifter, and because against certain matchups like Tearlaments, Dragonrider, where Shifter absolutely kills them in those situations, that's why they're still opting to side for it, even though they don't play all that well under it either. So, you know, Shifter, obviously, in my view, very toxic card. Hopefully it does get addressed on the next ban list, but for now, we do have to deal with it. So next we have Spooky Dogwood. Not really seen that much, but really just kind of played as a time card, unfortunately, with just how the game works nowadays. And of course, Phantasme, definitely not seeing that much play. Initially had a little bit of hype a couple YCS events ago because of, you know, for example, Unchained, Dragon Link, a lot of link summoning, so you can get some hand advantage, or rather at least sculpt your hand is more better way to say it, but still sticking around. Next, in terms of the most common board breakers / staples, you know, you have Feather Duster, like not much to say, just a really good overall back row wipe. We are also going to cover just Talents and Thrust together. They're very, very good. I think Talents, honestly, there's like a lot of debate for it to at least get limited at some point, hopefully soon. I think it is a very, very strong deck going first or second. And Thrust, I'm honestly surprised it's not in more topping deck lists. I think with the power of Thrust, you can basically just get access to any kind of like, you know, board breaker or floodgate going first or second, and just really flexible and an incredibly strong card. We also have Lightning Storm, similar to the likes of Feather Duster, just generic board wipes. And then you also have D-Berry. Unfortunately, it is still good against something like Purrely, which, you know, while it did have kind of a disappointing showing at the YCS Dortmund, you know what, it's still a tier 1 deck, right? And then speaking of Purrely, we also have Herald of the Abyss. That is actually seeing a decent amount of main deck play, presumably because these are probably in decks that are playing Thrust, just so they can just get this off, and they have a main deck out to something like Purrely Noir, which a lot of decks might not have. And realistically, even if you're not playing against Purrely, like the Herald of the Abyss can probably get rid of other kind of like problematic monsters anyways. You know, it serves as like a board wipe. And then we have Book of Eclipse. This is definitely seeing a decline in play because last time it was actually quite popular, and especially Book of Moon was actually more popular than Book of Eclipse, but now that has completely kind of reversed, and if anything, you don't really see too much of Book of Moon, at least in the topping deck list. So Book of Eclipse can still be good against Purrely, I guess, if they didn't hard make the Noir on their turn, and still pretty good in terms of going second in general. We also have Xyz Encore, so a lot of kind of like dedicated Purrely hate. I mean, Xyz Encore, I was actually kind of surprised it saw a little bit this amount of play still, because, you know, at least with Chimera as tier 1 in the previous ban list, you know, this was still something that can be used against him, and that was, you know, the most represented deck for the most part. But I guess it's still sticking around at this point, but, you know, only a side deck card if it is played. And then we have Chimera Fenrir, which of course, now that we don't really have Chimera, at least not right now, in terms of like topping decks, you know, Fenrir, we're back to kind of seeing this again as just like that generic staple that a lot of people were running, you know, in terms of it can serve as a board wipe, going second on break boards, attack, and also banish cards face down, and, you know, going first, it like constantly serves as like a wave, additional layer of interruption, and actually helps you maintain hand advantage as well, so really good. And then we of course have Super Poly as well. Now keep in mind that there were a lot of branded lists at top that were part of this video, and they're more likely to play Super Poly. That's probably why I made it this high, because otherwise, outside of those branded decks, I don't think Super Poly is really worth playing, right? I mean, against Purrely, it's not that good. Against Unchained, it can definitely come up. Against Tearlaments, I honestly don't find it that good, and coming as a branded player, because, you know, Rukalis will just come back. It didn't really do anything. I mean, again, I guess if they had something like, I don't know, Winda and another fusion, like maybe like the Grapha extra deck monster, like then sure, it's useful, but of course, Winda doesn't necessarily always come as like their turn 1 board. I find often it comes actually during like middle of like while you're trying to combo, and then they bring it on, you know, like you're on the opponent's turn. So Super Poly, I think it's all right. Next, we have Evenly Matched, which is certainly a card that's been on the decline lately. So against Purrely, of course, they can just keep the Noir, so it's not getting rid of that issue. Against Unchained, you know, they can always keep like the Caesar, and a lot of their cards will just kind of float back. Against Tearlaments, I mean, realistically, they may just have like the Grapha extra deck monster to be able to serve as an Omni Negate, but also they do have access to Crown post side at least, and, you know, assuming that you're probably only playing evenly post side anyways, at least only 2 deck lists were main decking this card, especially, which could come up if you are main decking Thrust. Next we have There Can Be Only One, which of course can be very good against Unchained. It can be really good against something like Floowandereeze and Dragonrider as well. And it is a floodgate that typically a lot of like the branded list can play, especially in the side or maybe even sometimes in the main deck. And similar to that line is also Zombie Roll, which is definitely been popular lately because of Floowandereeze. They can really hard lose to this card when they just cannot tribute unless they're zombie monsters. It can also actually hit something like Dragonrider as well, and even Unchained. You know, it prevents them from going into something like Yama or even let's say like the Caesar. Zombie Roll is especially popular again in branded, just because branded fusion can actually send something like Banshee, and so it's a lot more easily accessible. Next we have Droplet, which was not seen in too many lists, but at the same time now with the new ban list with Rise are kind of out of the mix, and you can actually send cards to the graveyard as cost more easily, then yes, Droplet is definitely going to see some more play, and you have to get used to that. And then we also have Change of Heart, which is, pretty generic card. Definitely another card that you can just add off of Thrust as well. And again, something like, let's say, like Unchained, or even like Tearlaments, where you don't want to like pop anything, like being able to just take, and then especially helping you OTK is certainly very nice. Alright, so lastly, I just wanted to cover some tech choices that were seen in like a small number of lists. And so basically we had something like Spellbound, Hatred, as well as Gravekeeper's Inscription. And so if you're not too familiar with Spellbound, I guess it kind of serves as like a worse way of playing D-Barrier, at least going first. But the good thing is that you can actually play this card going second at least. It is a quick play spell, and certainly something you can use against certain decks that, tend to like go into their extra deck mechanic like on the opponent's turn essentially. And so certainly want to also highlight that discount code for card bars as well as Tier 0 games. You can use code Hakuna5 for 5% off on Yu-Gi-Oh! Singles and Seal products, so definitely go check those out. We also have Hatred. This was seen in that sprite list that taught by Samir. I guess it's a way where you can kind of try to clear back row without like popping them, because again, something like Unchained or Tearlaments, like you're gonna be able to trigger certain effects for their benefit. At the same time, just keep in mind this only kind of bounces like the set spells and traps. So if it's like something like a Floodgate, like I don't know, there can be only one skill drain, they can just flip it and it will just stay on the field. So you have to kind of keep that in mind if you're gonna be able to play it. It kind of depends on like the meta as well as the actual deck that you're playing. And then lastly is the Gravekeeper's Inscription, which kind of was actually floating around back when, Unchained first started becoming like tier 1, because you can kind of like completely prevent them, especially when, let's say you're going first and you activate this. Like, how is your opponent really stopping this, right? Like, are they playing Sideframe Delta? Probably not. And so now with Tearlaments also being in the mix, this can technically be good, I guess, but at the same time, this was only seen in one of the topping lists, and so I don't think it's going to be like a very popular mainstay at all. Anyways, guys, that was it for the most played hand traps and staples for YCS Dortmund. Hopefully you found that helpful in terms of helping you prepare for your events coming in the next couple weeks or so. I certainly have Niagara Regionals coming up this weekend actually, so hopefully this was useful. Anyways, thank you all for watching. A huge thanks to my patrons as always for supporting the channel. You'll certainly have access to all the spreadsheets if you're a part of the Patreon. Anyways, that's it for me. Take care, guys.